Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And we're very fortunate to have a return guest this afternoon, Ned Tillman. Ned is a scientist, he's an author and a speaker on environmental issues and sustainability. He was out here about 4 years ago with his first book, which was called Chesapeake Watershed, A Sense of Place and a Call to Action. And now he's here to talk about his most recent book, a really wonderful book called Saving the Places We Love, Paths to Environmental Stewardship. So Ned, welcome back to NCTC. It's a pleasure to have you again.
Good to be here, Mark.
Perhaps a natural question, since you're a repeat visitor out here, is what's the relation of this book to your first book?
The first book was mainly focused on watersheds, and specifically the Chesapeake Bay watershed as a metaphor for others. And I got such good feedback on it that I thought maybe I should write a similar book for the whole country. So this later book is one that does use stories from across the country. It doesn't just deal with watersheds, it talks about mountains and oceans and rivers. And so it's really a book that probably should have much wider appeal than the first one.
Oh, great. And actually, you alluded to it, but your chapters are organized in a rather original and interesting way. Tell us how you organized the book and why you chose that format.
Initially, the book was just a series of anecdotes around the country, my experiences at some of the iconic places of the country, such as Denali, also Yosemite, Katahdin, Mississippi River, the Great Smoky Mountains. And then I realized that this might be a good way to look at how people relate to the natural parks and the forests, is that, you know, they go visit them and they fall in love with them. So I thought, why not talk about, you know, separate the chapters in a way that people can easily access it.
Great. And you open with mountains, and we're going to go to that in a second. But first, as people see the stunning cover of your book, and one of the things they'll notice is you have a website and a hashtag that comes up with your book. What's going on here?
Well, I'm trying to reach much farther than just talking about a book. So I've created an online community with other people, and it has a lot of resources there for people. So I'm trying to encourage people to tell their stories, put them up as a post, and there's also a place to help each other. So if they have good ideas, they can share them with others. And so anytime I post something, I always use a hashtag, Saving the Places. And I direct people to it as a resource to help them take action and save the places they love.
Have you gotten a lot of posts on the thing?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, we've just been up for about a month or so, but you know, I've received posts from the Alps and across the country. So it's just a matter of time of getting them all up.
Well, before we move across the North American continent, and in fact the whole planet is where you end up, you open with an interesting anecdote about I-95 and your backyard. Tell us a little about that.
Well, you know, it's one of those things you don't want to really tell the story, but it's such a compelling story, I opened the book with it. When I was 12, Interstate 95 cut through my backyard, basically. I grew up on a farm, and they took 40 acres to put this in. And, you know, it really incensed me as a boy that could happen. And my father had fought it, but at the end he had to accept it. But as a boy, I didn't think I had to accept it, so I went out and terrorized the poor people putting the highway in, until I finally realized one day that I could not stop that one. But I do think it was by the roots of my activism, and certainly since then I've been trying to follow the law and
we appreciate that.
But speak up on the issues that I think are important to me.
Your book opens with the mountains.
Yep.
Why did you pick that as a way to start the book?
I guess some of my most formative experiences have been climbing mountains. I have a summit list. When I was a young man, I thought summiting the mountains was the most exciting thing to do. As I've gotten older, I summit a lot fewer mountains, but I really enjoy getting out, walking around, and climbing mountains. But starting with the mountains, I thought, was probably the most powerful way to attract people's interest in the book and have them get engaged, hopefully inspire them to get outside and fall in love with a mountain of their own.
Let's go through a few of the images you have. We showed one of mountains and some of the other landscapes that are covered in the book. Yeah, what are we looking at here?
Okay.
Besides some beautiful wildlife shots.
Yeah, I try to put some good pictures in, right? Meadows, one of the chapters on meadows, and we have regulations that help us preserve wetlands and regulations to preserve forests, and we do a lot of reforestation in this country. But wetlands are probably one of the more endangered habitats. And when you start realizing all the species that we're losing because we've lost our meadows, I really wanted to address that. And people can help bring back the meadows, certainly in their own backyards in many cases. We work closely with a local utility and convince them to use integrated vegetative management along their right-of-way. Well, the right-of-ways are pretty wide,
yes,
and they had 500 miles of them. And the program worked out very well, and they're going to continue expanding it. So I think that was one major step that we did and that many people can do across the country.
It's a fascinating idea, yeah.
They were mowing it and spraying it, and it was very expensive to maintain it right away, especially in a wet, moist climate. That this actually is going to save them money too, as well as preserving an environment and helping us manage the stormwater that falls on those places as well.
So what are they doing there instead of mowing it?
Well, they did spray some of the most invasive plants, but after that, the seed bed of natural seeds going back thousands of years was strong enough that all these natives came back. And so the first year they did more spraying, and then the second year they did a little bit of topical spraying. And after 3 or 4 years, it's a beautiful meadowland of species that sometimes you don't see anymore.
It's probably a natural wildlife corridor too for them to move back and forth.
That's right. That's right. Until they get up to a highway, right?
Yeah. It cuts it off.
That's right.
Let's see your next landscape.
Okay. Let's see what else we got here.
Oh, this is good. One of the things I liked about your book a lot was you remind us of places that might not be as iconic as mountains or Yosemite and so on. So what are we looking at here?
Well, here I expanded the concept of meadows to the Midwest, where the Great Plains used to be, I guess I would have to say. And so these photos are what the Great Plains were like at one point, and there are a few places still preserved out there of these iconic settings of buffalo and other types of wildlife. So certainly I wanted people to remember that a large part of this country was meadows in a sense, and then we open it up and we develop, the Homestead Act, thousands and millions of people went out and turned it into farmland with only a few areas left.
And then I think we might have some scenes about what happened.
Yeah, certainly to manage those areas today, we have, there's not much rainfall, so we've had to drill wells down into the aquifers, which has produced a lot of the food in this country and the grains. Unfortunately, many of those aquifers are being depleted dramatically. So at some point, you're no longer going to have those aquifers, and these places may revert back to the Dust Bowl conditions that we saw, back in the 30s. This is a fairly dramatic black and white photo from those days, but just recently, the conditions are somewhat returning to that because there are we've had some droughts, and we've seen, this picture was just taken a couple of years ago, of a modern development with a dust storm blowing up.
One of the things that's really nice about each chapter is you offer solutions. It's not just a doom and gloom book. It is a path to better stewardship. What's the solution, say, for the Great Plains area?
Well, I think, just talking about that more holistically a second, I think the challenge is that all these places aren't preserved just because of happenstance. Our ancestors, spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of debating to preserve these places. And down through the ages, this has happened, and we have been given this gift of these wonderful preserved places. I'm not sure we're doing our job. Almost all these places are being threatened today. And so partly in the book is I wanted to reawaken people to the beauty of these areas. I wanted to inspire them to get out and fall in love with them with the hope that they would then learn about the threats and then take care of them. I think in the Great Plains we just have to manage our water a lot better. We need to preserve some of those great grasslands and the wildlife associated with them. And it's just going to be a a function of opportunity over the next few decades. If we do run out of water supplies, we should definitely think of converting them back to preserved lands of maybe the original grasses.
The more arid resistant grasses out there, and maybe some bison. I know Ted Turner's tried that.
He's got a few thousand.
We had one of his people out here a number of years ago talking about some of the bison restoration out there, so that's a possibility. Let's keep going through your environmental tour. This chapter, well, multiple chapters, but the watershed, particularly because of your base in Chesapeake Bay area and so on, was particularly poignant and interesting. What are we looking at here?
Well, the water is a different challenge in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
Certainly in the West, there's not enough of it. We're overusing it. The East, sometimes we have way too much of it. It's like, how do you manage stormwater runoff? And that's a real challenge in areas like the Chesapeake Bay, where you have a lot of the fertilizer on farms and in people's backyards getting washed off into the streams, and therefore causing problems in the rivers and the bays and the ocean.
Right.
So just acknowledging that there's a challenge and trying to figure out how to fix it, I think would be kind of the challenge of the decade, going out and managing our water supplies a lot better.
Let's look at some of the different watersheds and see what...
Okay. The last picture was the Colorado River, which, as many people know, never makes it to the ocean.
Right.
We use it all up. This slide of the Potomac River running through our nation's capital, it looks beautiful. I've kayaked and canoed it many times, but it does bring a lot of these nutrients down into the bay, causing algal blooms and causing dead zones. So every major river, that reaches the oceans or a bay has these dead zones in it. And this is a real challenge. I think here's a shot of the Chesapeake Bay, and it has 57 major rivers that feed into it. It drains the chicken farms in the eastern shore of the bay, the coal mines, and lots of farmland. The number one crop in this area happens to be lawns.
Yeah, tell us a little. That was fascinating. I had no idea about that till I read your book.
There are so many suburban parts to the Chesapeake Watershed that people have grass, and there's more of that managed than corn or soybeans, the whole range of crops. And so a lot of the problem is coming from our backyards, and we over-fertilize our backyards. You probably don't need to do that. So we have, it comes down to us. It's not a government solution. It's got to be an individual responsibility to understand their impact on their streams.
Most of us think lawns are pretty benign. What can we do, speaking of paths to environmental stewardship, to make our lawns less dangerous to the Chesapeake Bay watershed?
Well, certainly if we convert the grass to shrubs, meadowlands, trees, that helps a lot, and it slows down the water. The real problem is we paved over so much of the area with our rooftops and our driveways. We really need to figure out how to capture the water that runs off those impermeable surfaces. And many people are putting in rain gardens, which are depressions with certain types of plants in it, that allow the water to be captured on your property and filter into the ground, which is the natural process. It cleans up the rain, recharges the groundwater table, and that slowly recharges the streams and keeps them healthy 12 months a year.
Well, I warned you this was going to be a hard-hitting interview. No puff pieces here. So the question is, what does your backyard look like?
Well, that's interesting. I had about 4 acres and had a lot of animals on it. And I did try to manage it with a lot of shrubs and trees and a low area where the water would collect. But to reduce my energy footprint, I downsized. And I cut my energy use in half. And so I don't have a backyard at the moment. But collectively, we do. Our community does. And so we have put in several rain gardens already. We're planting a lot of trees. And we're trying to figure out what to do about our parking lot.
Are there solutions to a parking lot? What else can you do besides pave it?
Well, it is paved, but I think what we're going to do is at the lowest end of that paved parking lot, just run like a 10-foot by 100-foot long trench, biofiltration trench, where the water would all come there and filter back into the ground, as opposed to running off into a culvert and then into the stream that's badly scoured out because of the rain that's fell in the past.
And I should mention, that is the beauty of the book. There are about by my rough estimate, 1 million solutions described in there. It permeates the text throughout. Well, you could do this, or we could do this, and they're not all the changes are dramatic. Many can be done by individuals, and collectively they can have a huge impact. And it's just a very empowering book that way.
And it's mainly common sense,
Yeah.
except most of us don't have the time to think about it every day. I mean, just look what happened last year in Toledo, Ohio, when 400,000 people had the water turned off. That was pretty much, I think we missed that slide, pretty much a example of, here it is, runoff of nutrients from farmland and suburban areas into Lake Erie. And as there's a short anecdote in the book about Lake Erie being the Dead Sea of America about 30 years ago, and it was a great success story when we cleaned it up. Well, the last 5 years, we're not doing such a good job. You know, all these nutrients are running in, causing these algal blooms again, to the point that it was unsafe for people to drink it.
In addition to Lake Erie dying, you also talked about a river catching on fire. Tell us the story of the Cuyahoga.
Many of us probably remember that classic story or read about it. Certainly, it was in the 60s. A river, again, in that same general area in Ohio, caught on fire. Now, that was not new for that river. It had done that many times before throughout the industrial age because we've been dumping so much fuel into it. And that was kind of what we did back in those days. Well, in the 60s, it just caught the whole nation's attention that a river could catch on fire. And again, it became one of the poster children examples of what could happen. Again, a lot of money and time went into cleaning it up, and it's much, much better today. So I have a series of short stories just like that about the things you've heard of, Love Canal, Cuyahoga River, and I try to bring people up to date with what the real problem had been, what we did to fix it, and what it's like today.
Great. Well, now let's talk a little about storms.
Let's go back then. In this slide, this shows what happens when you have storms. You take not just the water that flows off your properties, but all the residue of society with it. So if there's any exposed land, that erodes and goes off. The fertilizers on your lawn goes off. Oil and gas leaking out of your cars. It's just everything gets flooded downstream. And that, has always been great. Nature's helped clean us up, right? We depended on that for centuries. However, unfortunately, there's so many of us that, some of these receptacles, the rivers, the lakes, and the bays, aren't big enough to deal with it. In this picture, it shows the residue flowing off the Susquehanna and the Chesapeake Bay offshore. And it's just dumping along the coast, which, out of sight, out of mind, might be a big problem. But the problem becomes is that's where most of the base of the food chain exists, is along our coasts. If you look offshore very far, it becomes more of an ecological desert. So all that life's right where we're dumping all this residue of society, which can't be good for us long term.
And how are we getting the carbon in there? Where is the carbon coming from?
All that, the natural carbon is all the life forms.
Right.
And now we're dumping all this chemical cocktail on top of it.
And are those coming from mines or so on, or where are they?
Well, the chemicals are just coming from everyday society now. We've done actually a wonderful job in the last 40 years cleaning up the worst of the dumping. People generally don't dump as much as they used to. I mean, when I was a young boy, you didn't have a recycling center. You had no place to take your waste pesticides or your waste fuel, so you just dumped it in the ground. That doesn't happen much anymore. I mean, 99% of that has stopped, which is great. But it's all the everyday pollution, from just our standard living, style of living. It comes from all the fossil fuel plants, burning coal and oil and gas. All that pollution is dumped for free into the atmosphere. It doesn't just stay in the atmosphere. It comes down, lands in the land, and gets washed into the ocean. Exhaust from your car. It's a lot cleaner today, but it ends up going up and then landing in the ground and gets washed in. So we really have to take a look. It's great that we're trying to get our cars more efficient, but why are we driving more and more every year? We have to think about those sorts of impacts.
That's good. Let's go back to the slides.
Okay.
What is this?
This is an image of the southern part of the Chesapeake Bay, but you can see this over many water bodies. The Gulf of Mexico has a much bigger dead zone than the bay does. But this just shows the algal bloom in the southern part of the bay in August, a few years ago. And you can just see the massive amount of algae growing in that water body. And all because it's fed from the nutrients that washes off of our backyards.
What can we do to counter this? I mean, once there's an algal bloom, is there anything you can do, or do you just have to wait for that to recess and are our only solutions from the original origin point, or can you?
Well, that's certainly the best thing to do is prevent it. I mean, it's much more expensive. We live near a lake, and when there's an algal bloom, you can drag it and try to remove it. It's very hard to do. So it's best to cleaning up at its source, and therefore using a lot less nutrients, and also capturing the water on our property so it doesn't flood off our property, scour out the streams, and dump all this material into the bay or the Gulf.
Okay. Let's go on to our next. What is this?
This is one of my favorite pictures, I guess, even though it's an awful picture. It's a picture, a group of friends and I kayaked down a river, the Potomac River, and it was beautiful for 6 or 7 hours until we got into the tidewater area. And at that point, we encountered tens of thousands of plastic bottles. And at first we thought we just came locally, you know.
Yeah, where were they coming from?
We were complaining about the people that lived down there, but
Right.
very quickly we realized that all those bottles came from the exact same place we did. Up in the Piedmont, you know, where things are more pristine. But there's 500,000 people that live in this watershed. If each of us lost one plastic bottle a year, this is what you get. So, you know, in a sense, from that day on, I've had this pledge of myself not to buy things in plastic bottles. That's hard to live up to.
Yeah.
But the whole concept of buying something that you're going to throw away in 60 seconds, you know, has really gotten me thinking. And so I really have cut back dramatically on anything that's throwawayable.
So you're a tap water fan?
I am a tap water fan. In fact, I analyzed my tap water and also analyzed a bunch of bottled water off the shelf. And let me tell you, there were a lot more volatile organic compounds in the plastic bottled water I bought from the store than there was coming out of my tap.
I've never seen so many water bottles. So they're trapped in there in the tidewater area? They're just
That's right.
collecting and
And the big storms may blow them out to sea. There's certainly pictures of a lot of data now how the oceans, each of the gyres in the oceans, the big circulation circles, have collected plastic in the center of those.
Well, storms do other things besides blow plastic bottles out to sea. And one of the most striking parts of your book were the impact of storms on the places we love. Let's talk a little about that. Because storms normally seem like something that's beyond our control. It's just an act of God or nature. Tell us a little about the storms.
Yes, the trouble with storms, aside from the fact that we may have higher frequencies now in bigger storms, is that they do interact with us in some of the most critical places. Here's an illustration from the eastern U.S. Where we have a barrier island along most of the Atlantic coast. And this barrier island in Maryland and Virginia was bifurcated once in a big hurricane back in, I think, the 30s, in 33. And since that time, sea levels have continued to rise. And what you see in this picture is south of the break through the barrier island, the sand beaches in the barrier island have been free to move westward with sea level rise. That's a natural thing to happen. But north of that break is a very built-up vacation spot called Ocean City. And we've spent millions of dollars over the year restoring the beaches. We don't want that beach to move because we have all this infrastructure built on it. And so you can see it's shifted eastward hundreds of yards, westward hundreds of yards relative to Ocean City, the southern part of that. So this is a real problem because as sea levels continue to rise, those barrier beaches will continue to move westward into areas that are populated. So we're going to have to deal with that. And the Ocean City area is just, it's just going to be a place that's going to waiting for disaster because as we have big storms and higher sea levels and big surges, that whole development out there is kind of left out near the ocean and will be destroyed at some point.
What's our solution to that? To ask you a tough one again.
Well, I think we really do need to deal with the carbon that we're dumping into the atmosphere. I mean, I think that in many cases is a problem throughout the country, because that excess carbon, you know, we are acidifying the oceans, we are acidifying the soils throughout the, you know, the mountainous areas or the rivers, and you can't just change chemistry without expecting results. And so I think we need to, as a society, to figure out how to reduce the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere.
Well, you gave us a good reason to. In addition to having solutions and being very positive, this book is infused with history, which I appreciate a lot. And you had a great little anecdote about Smith Island, a place I actually had never heard about. And it gives a nice context to some of the things we're dealing with global climate change and ocean rise. Tell us a little about Smith Island.
Well, Smith and Tangier Islands are two of the still inhabited islands in the lower part of the bay. Maybe 100 families out there, and a lot of it's marshland. So as sea level has risen in the past, it's getting wetter and wetter on the island, and it's really going to be, it would be a very difficult couple of islands to preserve. And so recently the states have decided to offer the people who live out there an exit strategy. They would buy out their homes. And so, you know, these people and their families have lived there hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so it's a very difficult solution, but it's probably a more logical solution than trying to save those islands.
It's a nice remembrance that we're losing cultural history as well as natural places with sea rise.
That's correct.
Well, let's see.
Let's see. Another challenge we have with the oceans and the beaches are, you know, are the spills. You know, we ship an awful lot of fossil fuels around, you know, from continent to continent. We do have dozens or hundreds of spills every year. Some are more major than others. Certainly offshore drilling has caused a lot of damage to our coastlines. I don't know how many people realize, but Santa Barbara was one of the first big spills in California. And
you had a first-hand encounter with some of the oil there. Tell us
yeah,
about that.
I mean, it was like 6 or 8 years after it happened. My wife and I were walking the beaches out there, and there's a lot of natural seepage in that area as well. But certainly the oil residue lasts quite a long time. And so, you know, it seems like every 10 or 20 years we have a major spill. Up in Alaska, you know, was the next big one, and then the Gulf Coast one a few years ago. These are major impacts. They're very dramatic. They don't clean up very quickly, but yet it's still not as bad as the burning the fuels and the damage of all the waste getting up in the atmosphere. So there's a couple of different challenges there.
Now, you did remind us, though, the Santa Barbara oil spill actually led to some positive environmental outcomes. That was really the first major oil spill to grab the nation's attention. And what were some of the environmental regs to come out of that?
Well, it's interesting. Throughout the book, I'll talk about the history of lots of different movements, the conservation movement, the preservation movement. I try to highlight them with, you know, discussions at the great national parks and the national forests and the reserves. But certainly during the 60s, there was a national awakening caused by some of these big spills. Also, National Awakening was a result of some good books written by like Rachel Carson. There were a couple of landmark events in that decade that, you know, created the EPA. You know, it was things we did. We just finally had gotten to, you know, we did too many bad things. All of a sudden, the majority of people wanted things changed. And certainly even during the Nixon administration, these things were created, EPA was created. So it was a big step forward. We've gotten much better control on our pesticides. We've tried to become more efficient with our energy use. We've made dramatic changes in 50 years. Unfortunately, our population keeps growing, you know, and so it comes a point where the more and more people you cram into a little box, the more regulations you're going to have because of our impacts. And I think that's what we face with. if we're going to continue growing our population, living in small places, we're going to have to stay on top of this forever. Somebody the other day told me, why do we have to keep funding this? You know, well, if you look back in history, you know, from like 1850 to 1900, it was a big debate about preserving land. Well, I'm glad they did that. And then in 1900s, they started talking about putting modern sewers in the cities. Yeah. I'm glad they did that too, but these were major fights. And all the way down through history, we've had these. Every 10, 20 years, there's a new thing we have to do. We wouldn't have to do it if we didn't keep growing. But since we keep growing and keep creating waste, we're going to have to keep doing it.
But you raise an interesting point there. How do you stop people from getting fatigued? Every time we solve DDT, a new problem arises. How do you solve people from getting cynical or tired or saying, didn't we? It seems like a new issue arises every decade or every couple of years and so on.
Well, that's exactly why I wrote this book. I mean, I was thinking, you know, we all get burned out from whatever effort we do, from recycling to putting rain gardens in. I think the reality is that we don't have the bandwidth individually to save the planet. But individually, we do have the capability to save a place we love. So that's the whole backbone of this book, is to try to inspire people to get outside, fall in love with something, whether it's a famous national park or just a creek in the backyard, you know, I don't care. Fall in love with something, and then realize that place is being threatened today. Because once you realize that, you might fight for it. You know, and basically we only save the places we love, right? You know, and if you can fight for it and have some impact, that's a huge step, because there are 7 billion of us. And if each one of those people would save a place they love, I think there's hope. I think it's individual initiative, one place at a time, and that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is inspire people to get outside and fall in love with someplace.
Well, that's a good segue to look at some more places either you love or are endangered, or sometimes both.
Well, it's just the image of the Gulf
oil spill
disaster from a few years ago, where people died and there was a lot of oil spilled. And, you know, then the whole question is, if we decrease the amount of fossil fuels we use, you know, is it possible to replace that with something else? And certainly there's been a lot of activity in solar and wind. Prices are coming down. There's a lot of installations. I think it's a bright spot. And if it was subsidized as much as we subsidize the fossil fuels, it probably would be competitive. Even more competitive. As the research I've done on fossil fuels, specifically coal, is that there's a major health cost to this country for burning coal. And if all those health costs were applied to the cost of coal would be twice of what it is today, which certainly makes the alternatives more economical. So yeah, I think there's a lot of hope there. The trouble is, right now, even after a couple years of major growth in both solar and wind, it's still only a couple % of our total energy needs. You know, it's going to take a much bigger effort than we're doing at this point. And so we're going to have to live with a mix until we get serious about it. And so, yes, fossil fuels will probably decrease in usage with time, but these other ones really have to grow, and we have to get real serious about energy efficiency.
And you pointed out some of the alternative energy sources like hydroelectric have their own costs. Tell us a little about dams. You address them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, when the first colonists came here, they looked at America and said it's unlimited resources, and what they were looking at was the wood supply. And we certainly proceeded to cut down almost all the woods in the country in about a couple hundred years. And the hydro was the next great energy supply. Hydroelectric dams eventually, but initially just turning grist mills and textile mills. In the Chesapeake Watershed, and when I did research for that book, I learned that there were like 65,000 dams built in that watershed. And there's a couple million dams nationwide. So we have exploited and developed that source of power. Of course, when you put in that many dams, you really wreak havoc on the natural flow of water and the natural migration pathways for fish and other species. And so we're struggling with that today. What do we do to keep the fish healthy at the same time as allowing these power plants to remain? And in our area, we've taken down a bunch of dams. And we're hoping to see hundreds of thousands of shad come back up some rivers.
You also mentioned sedimentation can be an issue from some of these dams because of what's in them, something we talked about just a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at a few more of your slides.
Okay.
This is interesting. You know, one of the biggest solar arrays across the river from us in Washington County is at the prison. It's a gigantic one up there. So I think this does go to your point, Ned, that solar is popping up all over the place.
And it's a question of residential versus commercial. There's several types of solar. We only have, we have residential units on less than 1 million homes in this country, and we have 65 million homes. So it's like we need to get moving. The more commercial scale ones, like the ones just in the picture, that was a 100-acre site.
Wow.
Just not far from here, at a college. And I have real mixed feelings about putting these huge systems out on natural areas, or farmland even. I mean, so I would much rather see them on prisons, on warehouse rooftops, embedded in highways. I think we have a lot of places we can go without having to cover up all of our great open spaces. And of course, the other challenge is, as we diversify our sources of electricity, we have to fix the grid. And all those right-of-ways I talked to you about, they have to be rearranged in some way that we can balance out different power supplies from different sources. And that's going to be very expensive. So none of these things happen very quickly.
Are there smart ways or stewardship ways to fix the grid?
Again, I think all of us have the opportunity to, one, you can put solar on your rooftop. Mm-hmm. Two, you can buy electricity from solar or geothermal sources. And three, the most important one is you probably can cut back your energy use and your energy costs by 30-40% just by becoming much more efficient. I mean, I told you earlier that I cut my energy use in half by downsizing my home.
Right.
Then I cut it in half again by insulating my attic, placing windows, upgrading my HVAC system, and just turning lights and power sources off. So there's tremendous savings and advances we can make individually, but that's only part of the problem.
Let me go back to something you said earlier, that this book and your previous book are based on places people love and have a connection to. And one of the challenges today, and you address it in the book, is young people perhaps having less access to these places. Richard Louv has written about nature deficit disorder and children not getting into the woods and so on. Do you see any solutions to that, to getting young people to feel passionate about some of the places that you felt passionate about?
I think it is a challenge, and I really appreciate the work that Richard Louv and others are doing. I see a lot of young parents, a lot of school teachers really helping the next generation understand the importance of all these things. And again, getting them outside is probably the most important thing there. I think it is a challenge when all of us, not just the kids, but all of us spend so much time in the digital universe. I mean, there's so many great advantages to that. But it's almost like I have to block time out to go for a walk. And I try to walk a couple miles every day outside. And if I don't do it first thing in the morning, sometimes it doesn't happen. So, yes, I think making sure people realize just for our health, we need to be outside. And for the future, we need to get the next generation outside, falling in love and protecting these places too.
Another question I have to ask you, because I'm the historian, is the end of your book. You look back at some previous environmental stewards, and the book is infused with great quotes, a few of which I jotted down for use in lectures or things, ranging from Edward Abbey to John Muir to Wendell Berry. Who of these past conservationists have been inspirational to you?
Well, it's funny because, again, most of us, when we're young, don't necessarily think much of history, right? And then as we get older, we really appreciate it. I was lucky because my father was quite a steward of the farm we lived on. He put a lot of effort into managing the water and the trees and the quail. And then later I realized my grandfather was also very active in New England in the preservation of fishing areas predominantly. And that got me interested in looking at others. And there's some great books out. And just understanding the efforts these people went through. I mean, I really think it's a wonderful story to look at the roots, and I do in the book, but you can read other things too. But look at the roots of some of these movements. I mean, after the Civil War, we were so decimated, spiritually in this country, that a lot of people just went west. And it really rebuilt their souls in many ways, I mean, really got them excited. And you look at the Romantic period of paintings of these pictures of clouds and rainfalls, and you think, oh, that they over the top on those paintings. But then if you go out there, you encounter some of those spectacular moments when the sun is setting or there's a rainbow. So I think they really captured something, and I think they did capture the imagination of many people back east. And I think that was really the beginning of the modern preservation, conservation, environmental movement, whatever you want to call it, was our realization that nature is so beautiful. And at the same time, without some thought and planning, we just destroy it, with the sheep and the cattle ranching and the lumbering. I hate to put regulations on people, but if you really think about it, all the effort they did to preserve those places, I think most of us think was a good idea. Really glad they did it. Yeah. And, it's really kind of up to us to keep that momentum going and to preserve these for future generations.
And that is a nice thread through the book. And when you talk about forests, you talk about Thoreau and the protection of forests and so on. It comes, it's naturally integrated in every chapter in the book, how this ties into the first Earth Day or the evolution of the environmental movement. So that comes across strongly. The last question I have to ask you, we've talked about some disasters and shown some grim pictures of dust bowls and oil spills and so on. Are you basically optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I guess I'm scared enough that every waking moment I devote to this.
I can attest to that. I mean, for people that don't know, you kindly have driven out here on a drizzly day and given up your day basically to communicate with us. So I just had to interject that so people knew how devoted you are to the subject.
And and at the same time, every time I go outside for a walk, or when I lead hikes, or when I give talks, I'm really inspired by everybody I run into. People really do care about our environment, and that gives me a lot of hope, because I don't think it's just me or you, right? I think it's people in China. I think it's people, all these places that are really suffering. They care about the health of their kids. They don't want wearing masks when they go outside. So I think I think this is probably one of the largest social movements of all time, is to try to get right with nature, try to get in balance. And what really drives me is I don't want to be here in 10 or 20 years watching my kids and grandkids suffer from something I could have prevented. So yeah, I guess I've got to be optimistic, because we've got to fix things.
Well, that's a good positive tone to go out on, Ned. Thank you again for coming out here. We hope you write a third book soon so we can get you back out here, but no pressure. And the book, Ned's most recent book, is a gorgeously written book, Saving the Places We Love, Paths to Environmental Stewardship. Thanks again for coming out, Ned. I hope everybody reads the book, and I hope they communicate on your hashtag, Saving the Places, and go to your website, and we'll get you out here when the next book is done. And thank all of you for tuning in.